Our approach to the relationship between responsibility and accountability, in the first instance, is concerned with understanding that fundamentally there is a difference between what one gives and what one gets. And if one considers the relationship of the self with the other in any given situation, then clearly what one gets comes from other to self, and what one gives leaves the self for the other. Now, if one considered the distinction between cause and effect from this point of view, then it is apparent that cause is something that you give and the effect is the outcome of that. So a naughty boy throws a snowball down the mountain and it takes out the village at the bottom once it had become an avalanche. The snowball is the cause, the effect is the destroyed village. So what sits in one's own hands is the cause of things, and the outcome, the result, is the effect of it, which therefore stands to reason that if you looked at the distinction between outcome and process, that process sits in one's own hands, it's what one gives, and outcome is the result of the process, and therefore the distinction between contribution and result would make sense. Similarly, contribution is concerned with what one gives, result is concerned with what one gets. And we would like to say that this distinction is very helpful when you consider the distinction between responsibility and accountability. Because of the two words, the word accountability seems to be the harder word. It has a real sense of consequences if you don't do what's required of you, which suggests to me that you can't really be held accountable for something you don't personally do. Accountability is concerned with what sits in your own hands, and responsibility is concerned with the outcome, the result, or the effect of what you do. And you can only be held fairly accountable for what you personally do. Now, let's assume that our fellow over here is a worker in some kind of a firm where he does certain tasks and he achieves a result from having done those tasks. So maybe he's a salesperson who makes a number of calls in a week, and there's a sales result as a result to his calling. The calling of potential customers is the task that he does. It's what he gives. What he gets is the sales result. And that means to say that from our point of view, his accountability is to do the tasks according to standard, and his responsibility is to achieve an outcome or a result. Now, what that means for the person that he would report to, let's say his supervisor, it is clear that the supervisor would achieve a result which is a cumulative result of all the workers that work in her area. But the question is, what does the supervisor personally do? Well, in the first instance, she might do some tasks herself. She might call certain high-value clients, but the rest of what happens in her area gets done through workers. And the question is, what's her contribution with regard to what gets done by the workers? And in the first instance, one needs to then ask herself, well, what should a boss be doing for a worker? And we have a question that helps us to understand that, and that is to ask oneself, well, who's the sort of boss that somebody would work for because they really wanted to? And what we have here is a list of attributes that are reasonably typical, attributes that we've sort of seen coming from bosses throughout the world. And what's interesting about that list is that there's always two themes in the list. There's a soft and a kind theme, like a boss who's kind and approachable and patient. And the best word for that kind theme is the word care, because what the employees actually saying to the boss is, listen, have a genuine interest in me, care for me, which suggests that the first thing that the supervisor should be doing for the worker, her contribution to the worker, is to care for the worker. The second set of themes that one gets in the list normally have a harder implication. Like, for instance, if you work for a boss who's always honest, that boss isn't always going to be nice. They might say things to you that you find upsetting at the time. And the benefit to you then is that you know where you stand, you learn and you grow, which means that harder theme is all about growth. And we found this to be completely universal. Whoever you ask this question of, if you ask people who's the boss they'd work for because they wanted to, they'd always say these two things: a boss who cares for me and grows me. And the question is, why are those criteria so universal? Well, if you consider that the first relationship of power that you have with another person is with your parents, then this should be significant because we have an intuitive understanding that the first manifestation of something is normally the principal manifestation. In other words, you can learn the principle of a matter by examining the first manifestation. Now, the first manifestation of power is parenting, and in this relationship, there are two people. There's a parent and there's a child. And the job of the parent for the child is very specific. First of all, the parent has to care for the child and then enable the child to grow, which basically means to say the job of the big one for the little one in any relationship of power is care and growth. What constitutes legitimate power is care and growth. In other words, that's why the contribution of the supervisor should be to care for and grow the worker. Now, this issue of growth is actually quite nuanced because a way to explore what this implies is to use this fishing analogy. If you said to somebody, how would you empower somebody to fish? They would say a whole list of things like, I'd need to give somebody a hook, a line, and a sinker, and a bait, a license. And you can call that stuff means. But that clearly won't be adequate because you also need to teach the person how to use those things. And so you need to teach them how to fish and where they should fish and why they should fish. We call that element ability. But even those two things aren't adequate because if you were dealing with a particularly lazy person and you gave them all the means and the ability they may require to fish, and then you say to that person, don't worry, if you don't catch a fish, I'll give you one from my freezer, then the person still won't fish. Which means to say the last thing you've got to bring to the party is kind of a toughness, which means to say, if you don't catch a fish after the starve, that is called accountability. In other words, what we're suggesting is that empowering people or growing people means to give them the means, the ability, and the accountability to do what's required of them. Which suggests then that if the supervisor is growing the worker, then the supervisor's job is to give the worker the means, the ability, and the accountability to do what's required of them. So the supervisor's total contribution is to do some tasks herself, to care for the subordinate, to give the subordinate the means and the ability and the accountability to do what's required of him. That is her contribution. That's what she gives. Her responsibility is therefore to get a result. What she should be held accountable for is to do the tasks that she should be doing herself to standard, to care for her subordinate and to give her subordinate the means, the ability, and the accountability to do what's required of him. That then invokes a further question. So, what does that mean up the hierarchy? What does that mean for the manager of the supervisor? Well, in the first instance, this suggests that the manager is also trying to achieve a result. And that result is the cumulative result of all the supervisors, in fact, all the people who work in her area. Her personal contribution to the result, what she does herself, may be to do some tasks herself. She might have certain high-level administrative tasks that she does, but the rest of what she does gets delivered for her through the supervisors who report to her. So, consistently with the supervisor's role for the worker, the contribution she should be making to the supervisor is to care and grow the supervisor. And if we say her job is to grow the supervisor, it is to give the supervisor the means, the ability, and the accountability to do what's required of her. Which means, similarly to the responsibility and accountability of the supervisor, the manager's responsibility is to get the cumulative result that comes from her area. Her accountability is to do certain tasks herself and to provide care, means, ability, and accountability to the supervisors who report to her. Now, why is it important to understand this? If we understand that what the manager gets, her responsibility, is a result, and what she gives is certain things that achieve that, and that's her accountability, when we focus the manager's attention on what she gives, we focus her attention on things that are in her power. In other words, we empower the manager. Whereas when we focus her attention on what she's getting, we focus her attention on things that aren't in her immediate power. So if we want to empower the manager, we focus her attention on what she personally does. Now, just by way of summary, there's a few things that I would like to just suggest with regard to the distinction between responsibility and accountability. First of all, results are what you get. Contribution is concerned with what you give. Results are measured against targets by using numbers. Contribution, on the other hand, is assessed against a standard. Let's assume, for example, that you are coaching me to run hurdles and you know that my legs should be parallel to the ground, otherwise I won't clear the hurdles. And you say to me, you aren't lifting your leg high enough after observing my performance. The question is your observation of my performance subjective or objective? And it's perfectly objective. However, this observation has not produced a number. In other words, you can be perfectly objective, yes, no, against a standard. When you are holding people accountable, that's the kind of assessment that needs to happen. You need to be checking what people should be contributing personally, yes, no, against a standard. Responsibility is about the definition of result areas and gets cascaded top down. So in our sales environment, the sales manager gets a certain result that she needs to achieve in a period. She would have a conference with her sales supervisors. She would cascade that overall sales result to supervisor size results, and the supervisors will do the same with the people reporting to them. So there'll be a rolling down or a cascading down of result areas from the top to the bottom. However, what each person personally does, you have to assess bottom up. Accountability is concerned with what people should be personally do and is constructed bottom up. You can't identify what a supervisor should be contributing to a worker reporting to them unless you know what the worker should be doing. Further to this, responsibility can be shared. It is like the entire team owns the final result of the game, the score on the scoreboard. Accountability, however, is individual. It's concerned with what each person should personally do. And then finally, the definition of responsibility precedes the definition of accountability. It stands to reason that you can't work out who needs to do what until you've basically identified the objective or the result you're trying to achieve. Thank you very much.